Developed by 64's and published by Platonic Friends, Demon Turf is a Super Mario 64-inspired 3D platformer collectathon indie game available on Xbox One, Xbox Series X and S, PS4, PS5, Nintendo Switch, and PC, so essentially everything on the market right now. You might have already seen some footage of this game on my channel, in which case you saw some of my speedrun attempts of the Demon Turf Trials, a playable demo that rotated each week for 30 weeks with a completely different level to speedrun each week, each level with its own respective leaderboard and #1 winner, or champion. If you didn't hear, I did in fact get the world record for trial number 3, and as such, the Tanuki Tail channel mascot will be featured in the game somewhere, along with the portraits of all the other 29 champions. That was the most genius marketing strategy for any indie game I've ever seen, but I digress. Today, I'm reviewing the actual retail game itself. You might think that such investment in the game already would result in some kind of positive bias, but I can assure you that I am rating this game as critically as I would anything, as you will know by the time you finish watching. Immediately, you will notice that it unmistakably has a very solid and unique art direction with a saturated but darkened color palette that feels reminiscent of what I can only describe as Halloween meets the kind of carpet you would find in a birthday party room at an arcade or a Chuck E. Cheese's in the 90s or something like that. Maybe a little, Real Monsters as well, if anybody remembers that show. The playable character, Beebs, along with other NPCs and enemies, exist in their 3D modeled world as a series of 2D sprites whose perspectives change depending upon the camera angle through which they are being viewed at any given time, a la Paper Mario. If you look hard enough, you can find some ugly spots where 3D models clip into each other or textures overlap, but I don't think anybody plays platformers for the immersion anyway. Included in what I consider to still be art direction is the music, which also has a very strong direction that fits the game perfectly despite the soundtrack's range. I think it would technically be considered some kind of Splatoon core hip-hop, for lack of a better term, but I can just let you hear some of it for yourself. For reference, I played this on my gaming PC through Steam, and to get performance questions out of the way, it did run fine, except when recording footage while playing at full screen. As such, note that's why gameplay shown here might display some frame drops. It's obviously not a graphically intensive game by any means, so this problem must be some kind of optimization issue or something. I understand that creating a video game to run on PC can be very tricky due to the sheer amount of varying builds out there, but I had to mention this anyway. Do keep in mind, however, that I played on and recorded footage of a pre-release build, so patches might have already optimized the game better by the time you're watching this review. As for the Switch version, I know a lot of people might be curious about its performance, and I've been told that it runs at a stable 30 FPS, which is fine for a platformer, but I much prefer the 60 FPS afforded by my PC. I said this game is inspired by Super Mario 64, and that's most apparent in Beeb's moveset. Like Mario, you can do is triple jump, side jump, wall jump, and super jump, but instead of having a crouch, you have a spin button, which you need to hold in order to start a super jump like Mario. But this spin button, when used in the air, can also buy you more aerial hang time and afford you more horizontal coverage. Beebs can also perform a double jump in which she transforms into a bat to flap her wings once. Something else Beebs can do that I haven't seen in any other game is her dribble, as in basketball dribble, not saliva dribble. Obviously. When pressing the jump button after entering a spin state in order to get a super jump, if you keep hold of the jump button and release it at the right time when making contact with the ground, you get a little bounce off of the ground like a basketball. If you've ever played Soul Calibur, it's kind of like what's called a just frame, something that rewards you further for pressing or releasing buttons at the exact right moment once you acquire a sense for it. What's weird is that this dribble move is something that was implemented into the game pretty late in development, so me and the other speedrunners were playing on builds that lacked this move for a while. In hindsight, I can't imagine how we were doing it, because the dribble move is one of those things that you can't live without once you get a taste of it. You don't think you need it until you have it. You also have the ability to spam punches or charge up a big palm attack for combat, but that's something I'll get to later. I'm just talking about platforming stuff right now. In these ways, movement feels very nostalgic and intuitive, but it also differentiates itself well enough to have its own identity. Demon Turf just nails the platforming physics. It feels fun to simply move around in this game, and that's the most important part of any 3D platformer, if you ask me. This is also made possible because of how good the camera is. Beebs is displayed as a silhouette of sorts when behind certain smaller or miscellaneous objects, and I can imagine that a lot of players might overlook the amount of work it took in deciding which objects should be, quote, translucent versus which objects the camera should stay in front of. Game cameras are like lighting in theater. Most audience members actively think about it only when it gets screwed up, but if you aren't thinking about it, that probably means it's being done well. Note that these aforementioned abilities are only what comprise the starting moveset, because you eventually get access to 4 turf abilities whose naming convention will make more sense later when I explain how they're actually obtained. You acquire them in a specific order, and they include the grapple hook, wheel, crow, and time bubble. The time bubble lets you charge up and launch a projectile, which expands into a bubble upon impact, everything caught within being slowed down save for some specific objects. It's the least noteworthy turf ability in that there are few spots where it's useful, and even then, I don't think many of those instances actually require it to be used. The grapple hook isn't ever particularly fun to use either, but you get it the earliest, and it is used a lot in flipping switches, pulling yourself across distances, moving objects, and removing enemies' shields in combat. You might be questioning how something that sounds like the hook shot from Zelda isn't fun, but the thing is that it doesn't actually handle like the one from Zelda. Instead of having free aiming with it, it locks onto designated nodes, and you can't use it anywhere else. In the cases in which you're using it to do anything but pull yourself forward, you have to hold the button for a sufficient amount of time until a ring fills up, and then the hooked object gets pulled to you. To boot, while you're holding the button and waiting for the ring to fill, the camera enters this disorienting, locked over-the-shoulder mode that limits your vision, which can be detrimental in combat situations with one-hit kills. The combat is definitely the weakest part of the game overall, and so it slows down the game's pace even more when you have to use this grapple hook in the middle of it. In theory, I think these combat sections were supposed to add some variety to the game in order to prevent it from ever feeling stale, but the platforming itself is definitely strong enough that it could have carried the entire game by itself. Fortunately, most combat encounters can be handled relatively quickly once you realize that the fastest way to deal with them is to push enemies into spike hazards or simply push them into a pit. Or, if you're speedrun routing like me, you'll find that most of these fights can be skipped entirely. Again, neither the grapple hook nor the combat are bad per se, just boring. I know that sounds like a tangent, it's just kind of hard to mention the grapple hook without mentioning the combat and vice versa, but I needed to talk about the combat sometime anyway, so back to turf abilities. The wheel ability and the crow ability are the two that are actually really fun to use. The wheel ability entails transforming into an Ouroboros, a serpent eating its own tail, and automatically rolling forward at a speed which increases the longer you stay in this form. You can modulate the speed to an extent, but the fun with this comes from trying to control the wheel as you approach mad speeds. I think Sonic fans will like this one, and I expect this ability to get used pretty much everywhere possible once acquired in speedruns, as it was in the Trials speedruns. This ability also has the extra utility of serving as an extra jump, because activating it in the air lifts you upwards a little bit. As for the crow, that is also a transformation ability in which you turn into a crow and gain the ability to glide, much like the winged cap from Super Mario 64. It allows for some pretty big skips in the right hands, and as a result got nerfed multiple times during the Trials speedruns, but it is still pretty strong. The devs have actually been pretty cool about designing the game with speedrunning in mind. Do note that keyboard and mouse players have an inherent advantage over controller players when it comes to using the wheel and crow abilities. The precision afforded by a mouse with high sensitivity is a must if you want to optimize turns in wheel form and pulling up at the earliest possible opportunity in crow form. The devs did add individual sensitivity sliders for the wheel and crow in order to offset this inequality, which is something us speedrunners were asking for, but despite that, the mouse is still obviously superior, though I do have to applaud the devs for listening to the feedback and implementing it. If, however, you're just playing casually and don't care about speedrunning, either control method should be perfectly fine. I just thought I should mention it. Another similarity to Super Mario 64 is a hub world that one might argue is a level in and of itself. In said hub world, not only can you obviously access actual levels to be beaten, but you also have many distractions and side quests which open up as you progress further and further in the game, such as stores, more on that later, a photo gallery, more on that later, 10 soccer minigames, more on that later, 25 combat challenges, which are okay. As I already said, I'm not too big on the combat in this game, so these 25 combat challenges are whatever, in my opinion. And also 8 arcade games, which are basically just additional levels, but with a pixelized filter over it, and 30 trials, which are also additional levels, and these trials are what I separately put 80 plus hours into speedrunning prior to even playing this game. But before I elaborate more on the hub world, let me explain how the game's basic progression system is formatted. The standard levels are divided into 4 biomes, or turfs. There is a desert turf, there's a beach turf, there's a city turf, and there's a snowy mountain turf. Each turf has 7 base levels and its own boss fight. By the way, the levels do have their own online leaderboards and default trophy times to shoot for, which the game does count as part of its 100% completion if that's something you're going for. Each level is completed by grabbing the battery at the end, which basically serves as the stars from Super Mario 64, but there are also 3 optional cakes to be gathered along the way. Once you have enough batteries, you can challenge the turf boss to a boss fight. Upon beating said boss fight, you acquire a new turf ability, and the next turf opens up. Finally, once you get enough batteries in general, you can challenge the big bad Demon King himself, who serves as the antagonist in the game. However, merely beating all the levels and bosses by themselves is not going to net you enough batteries to fight the Demon King. Instead, when you beat a turf boss, not only does it unlock the next turf, but it also unlocks a return trip to the current turf now that Beebs has control of it. These return trips are remixed versions of the levels, but also have their own battery at the end. You need 50 batteries to fight the final boss, but you'll only have 28 if you only do the regular levels. So even if you don't care about 100%ing this game, you're going to have to complete at least some of the return trip levels in order to beat the game. To prevent those sites from getting stale, each return trip does have its own aesthetic gimmick. The desert turf gets a sandstorm upon the return trip, the beach turf gets a thunderstorm, the city turf gets rain and falls to nighttime, and the snowy turf gets, you guessed it, a snowstorm, which is actually really hard to see in for some reason. Another difference with the return trip versions of levels are the collectibles they contain therein. Regular versions of levels contain 3 cakes each, like I said, but return trip levels contain 50 lollipops each. I did mention that this game is a collectathon, and I expect that to be the most divisive aspect about the game. I think the devs expected this too, and I think that's why they included a dedicated dowsing machine button, which, when pressed, materializes a big arrow that points to whatever the nearest collectible is, even if that includes one of the keys which are required to progress in the level. Some levels require you to find these keys. I didn't think that needed an explanation, but it sounded weird suddenly bringing up keys as if there's some important thing, but they're not. Some levels just require you to find keys. That's not important. Anyway, some purists might critique this dowsing feature for undermining the search and discovery factor of what makes a collectathon, but I suspect it's only included to alleviate the dreaded needle in a haystack effect whenever you're missing just one collectible in a level. Honestly, I feel pretty neutral about this feature due to none of the collectibles ever being that hard to find or even particularly hidden anyway. It feels as if they're more so there purely for the sake of being collected rather than being found, if that makes sense. Again, this isn't going to entice anyone who's already not a fan of collectathons. Fortunately, all these cakes and lollipops are completely optional, unlike the batteries. You may want to consider, however, that cakes and lollipops can be used as currency. For those interested in fashion soulsing it up, you can exchange lollipops for dyes at a store in the hub to change the color of your hair and clothing, and you can make different combinations with these colors. Something else that's cool about the color dyes is that it also changes the color of your wheel turf ability. You can even buy animals from the pet store if you're okay with them defecating on your head, I guess. More importantly, there is a different store that sells mods in exchange for cakes. These mods actually affect gameplay, and because of their significance, you have a limited number of slots in which you can assign purchased mods at any given time, each mod having its own slot value depending on its usefulness. Think of it like having a loadout. For example, the best mod in my professional opinion is the one that makes Beebs' spin ability gain some additional altitude. Remember when I was talking about the spin ability? I said it just lets you stay in the air longer and it also lets you get more horizontal coverage. Well, with this mod, it actually lets you get some extra height. Not only does this allow the player to perform some skips that are otherwise impossible, but it's also the best way to make combat encounters less of a slog. Normally, spinning into enemies just stuns them for a brief period, but with this mod, spinning into enemies stuns them and makes them float into the air for the same duration. While they're floating, you can charge up a punch and knock them over the short walls that surround most combat areas before they fall back down into a pit or some other hazard, making the whole encounter a breeze. Even though this mod isn't explicitly listed in the combat category of mods, it really is the best combat mod. Also, about the aforementioned soccer minigames, this mod also works on the soccer balls in the same way it works on enemies. You can make them float, which allows you to easily get the balls over a lot of the barricades put in your way. My point is that these mods add a lot of transformative value to the gameplay, so they're definitely something you should look at and experiment with when playing the game. The other mod I want to shout out is the one that adds a stun effect to your camera's flash whenever you take a picture. A lot of games these days seem to have a photo mode, but I can't think of any other game that weaponizes it like that. Speaking of your photo mode, I'll now explain the photo gallery that I mentioned in the hub world. Essentially, you're given a descriptive list of scenes, people, and objects, some more cryptic than others, that you're tasked to snap pictures of. You're then supposed to bring back these pictures to be rewarded with cakes or lollipops. I should also mention that doing the soccer minigames, the Coliseum challenges, and the trials, they all reward you with either cakes or lollipops as well. What's nice is that when taking a picture of something, it will actually say on there, it will actually say on the photo that you just took if it counts towards a photo hunt or not. A good rule of thumb is to read your photo hunt descriptions regularly, and especially before going into a level so you won't miss anything. Alternatively, if you see anything weird or out of the ordinary, there's probably a photo hunt for it, so you might as well stop and snap a pic just to be safe whenever you see anything strange. If you shirk these and then decide later on that you want to do them, you're going to have to do a lot of backtracking, so I'm warning you now to be proactive about these photo hunts because there are 50 in total. You do have a limited amount of photos you can carry at one time, however, so I wish there was an option to mass delete everything at once in order to make space quickly, rather than slowly and painstakingly deleting one at a time, because you do have to delete the photos to make space, and having to do them one at a time like that is a little tedious. When talking about the batteries earlier, you might have noticed that I said they are at the end of each level rather than them being in each level. That indicates the main difference between Demon Turf and Super Mario 64, and this might be one that disappoints those who were looking for a true Mario 64 successor. While the levels in Demon Turf are large and do have a great sense of scale, they are quite linear. This isn't inherently a positive or a negative thing, just something people should know about since I keep bringing up Mario 64. In Mario 64, each level contains multiple stars, right? In Demon Turf, each level has only one battery if you're counting the return trips as separate levels. As such, the game is more about the platforming challenge itself of going from point A to point B rather than exploring per se. The NPCs in levels rarely have anything interesting to say either. However, there are a lot of references and Easter eggs in this game, so do stay observant throughout your playthrough. Due to the significant length of each level, a cool feature is that you can actually place your limited number of checkpoints manually by having Beebs stab a flagpole into the ground, and you can teleport between these checkpoints if you so wish. If you ever find yourself complaining that the checkpoint placement is bad, you can only blame yourself. Keep in mind that once placed, a checkpoint can't be moved without exiting and restarting the whole level, so there's a certain contemplation and commitment involved that I actually really like. I usually had enough confidence in my own skill to hoard the checkpoints and only use them later once I knew I was at least in the second half of a level, although this did sometimes result in me kicking myself. But that's just part of the fun. Naturally, being a collectathon, it's a pretty decent length for a 3D platformer. If you only focus on reaching credits, you can easily beat it in under 20 hours, but it'll take over 30 if you want to complete everything. This game is definitely worth the money, and I highly recommend it to those who enjoy platformers, and of course, I also recommend the game to speedrunners looking for a new speed game, or people who are interested in getting into speedrunning for the first time. The built-in leaderboards here make it pretty easy to start getting competitive without having to set up any kind of splits program or anything like that. One last critique, especially when it comes to speedrunning this game, would be that I really wish you could have more than one save file, so that way, just for completion's sake, you could keep a 100% file intact without having to get rid of it whenever you start a new game and start from the beginning. Anyway, let me know in the comments if you have any questions, and I will see you all later, so bye for now.